Uh, different adult. Oh,
I'm sorry, what was that, Bob?
nothing. All right.
Okay, I am going to close the breakout rooms. Close all breakout rooms, yes. And everybody should be joining this main room now. Hopefully, all breakout rooms are people jumping back in?
Coming back in.
They are coming back in. Okay, great.
Yes, we are coming back in.
Oh, great. Okay.
Whether we want to or not.
We're all kicked out of the breakout room.
Yay.
The conversation was just getting really good.
Oh, I'm so
That's what
sorry.
always happens.
I'm so sorry. Okay, just to let everybody know that I am recording. I had the option of recording to the cloud or recording to my computer. I chose the computer and we are recording. I'm just going to check that one more time. We are recording. Okay. And I'm going to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just grab the next slide to this CNG presentation. I'm Alyssa Khan. I'm going to be facilitating this meeting. But the real people that you want to listen to are the people who are presenting. So we will get to that in a minute. For today's session, please make sure you mute your audio connections if you're not already muted. But if you have any questions later on, by all means, unmute yourself or use the chat feature. I will be looking at the chat. We speakers, please don't forget to use your video when you're speaking. Submit questions to the chat, as I just said, and we will be recording. That's what happens when you wing it, you repeat yourself. Okay, thank you to all our full CNG DC sponsors. We have Prometric, Examity, PSI, Lineup, Cobalt, Measure, Pearson View, Surpass, and did I miss anybody? I don't think, Proctor U and Yardstick. So thank you very much. And these are our supporting sponsors: ACES, American Associations of Medical Assistants, HUMRO, CMAA, SHRM, and the Board of Certified Safety Professionals. And today's showcase is sponsored by Examity. Today's showcase sponsor is Examity, and I'm going to turn over the presentation to Graham Livingston, who will present on Examity and multimodal test delivery. So Graham, it's all yours.
So good morning, everybody. I just mentioned actually in the breakout room that this is my first time with CNG. And so I'm the newbie, although having just spent 30 minutes in the room, I don't actually feel a newbie anymore. Okay, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, very briefly, Examity and who I am, and then just go through a couple of slides. So I'll only keep you just a few moments. So Examity, well, Examity started around 2003. We see ourselves as the global leader in online proctoring. And we see our team as the best in the business. About me, well, as I said, my name is Graham Livingstone. I started in certification working for a performance-based testing company. And then I moved to PSI in a little over a month. I moved to Examity as Director of Business Development. I've actually been in the IT industry for over 25 years, with most of my time spent actually in the IBM channel. I also chair education. I chair the education at the IT Certification Council. I suppose I've been, that makes me about 23 if my maths is correctly. So a little bit about the reasons why I chose to work for Examity. I've been very fortunate to have worked closely in the past with Bill West and Khalil Blase. So I knew from that Examity was a people business, and that was really important to me. And obviously being originally from the UK, although I currently reside at Bel Air Beach in Florida, weather's slightly different. I believe it was Richard Branson. I'm sure you all know who Richard Branson is. He built up his Virgin Empire, who said, if you take care of your employees, they will take care of your clients. And that's how we built a global business. So it was really important to me. I also wanted to mention that Examity, as you're probably aware, are actively engaged with CNG as sponsors and for volunteers. Okay, just moving on. Just talk a little bit about our products, our solutions, multimodal flexibility. Flexibility for us is the key to certification program success. It allows the test taker to literally test anytime, test anywhere. And at Examity, candidates can complete their exam where and when it's most convenient for them. They can either opt for an automated exam assignment. Well, actually, it's automated exam assignments actually is how we decide based on the low or high stakes, which proctors we will assign based on exam complexity. An important thing is about our test taker launch time. It averagely takes about 7 minutes to get them through the whole process and launch. That's doing the room scan. And because obviously when the candidate has spent through their LMS doing their training and sitting there for their exam, we want to try and keep any anxiety as minimal as possible. So we feel that due to that onboarding time, the test taker experience has really improved significantly. And I know that some of the sessions later we'll probably hear a little bit more about some of the challenges. Okay, so another important thing for us is the low proctor to test ratio. We average around 2 to 1, which I'm not sure how that compares with other online proctoring providers, but for us, it enables strict security and it really protects the program integrity. Along with the live audit of exams, this further reduces security issues. So for us, it's all about securing validity of exam and exam content. The ability to select an automated online proctoring or live online proctoring solution, that also provides the flexibility to clients, depending on the type of exam or certification. Again, this can allow businesses to maintain accreditation while supporting their psychometric quality without hindering the test taker experience. Okay, just moving on. I just want to talk a little bit about accessibility, allowing the test taker to have accessibility to exams seamlessly, scalability, whether the exam program has a need to provide testing for 100 test takers or 3,000 test takers, to allow that, and also the security of the exam. So in terms of accessibility, candidates can communicate with support during their exams via chat, phone or email. Now, I know that just in the other room, there was some challenges around, the expectation is that the candidate taking a test from home is having to do their own technical support. Well, we provide that, as I mentioned, in the ways. We have trusted partners, really important for Examity, because our focus is on delivering the online exam experience. But we work with partners to enable the client to choose which partners they wish to engage in delivery of their certification program. So they can take, if they have a desire or they have a relationship with an item bank or a psychometric service provider, exam delivery, driver, partner, they can then utilize those and provide to their test takers best-in-class partner solutions. So the flexibility around being able to change between live and auto proctoring for every test and about putting different regulations and rules on each test, individual tests with higher level of security or less is needed. We can also provide a browser lockdown as an option if that's desired. And that's part of protecting the data, the exam integrity. Also, we have the ability at the client's request, if they choose, is to mask content if required as well. Again, that if there are any disruptions, then we know that the exam content can be masked and the test taker can't access it. So it's all about data protection. So with that, I'd just like to close and just thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for me personally, the opportunity to meet everybody at CNG. And thank you for taking the time to hear me out. And if you're curious, you want to hear more, my email address is there, or you can reach out to Examity, reach out to us online. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you so much. Okay, so on to the presentation this morning, multimodal test delivery considerations and implementation. I'm going to do some very brief introductions, but after that, the presenters will actually go into a little bit more detail, introducing themselves. We'll discuss about understanding the playing field of multimodal test deliveries, but specifically live remote proctoring and other types of proctoring, program considerations, psychometric considerations, and then any commentary or questions and answers that you would like, questions that you might have and answers that we may have or others in the audience may have. So that's the general agenda we will be following. So these are your colleagues who are going to be presenting today and sharing their experiences. We have Bill Ellis, who's the Executive Director of the Board of Pharmacy Specialties, Aaron Weissman, who's a Senior Specialist for Certification Security at SHRM, Alyssa Meyer, who's a Senior Certification Program Specialist at the National Association for Healthcare Quality, Francis Nerick, who's the National Director of Credentialing at the American College of Sports Medicine, John Weiner, Chief Science Officer at PSI, Bob Blackwood, Business Development Manager, Pearson VUE, and Leon Kwan, who's Dr. Leon Kwan, who's Senior Vice President, Prometric Test Development Solutions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Elisa. So just to give some framing on the organization that I work for, I serve as the Executive Director of the Board of Pharmacy Specialties. It's a position I've held since 2011. We currently have 14 certifications, 20 staff, and administer our exams globally. So it gives you a little bit of background on the organization. I also want to thank CNG for the opportunity to participate today, and thank Graham and Examity for their support of the program. And with that, I'll toss it over to Aaron.
Folks, my name is Aaron, excuse me, Aaron Wiseman, and I work for the Society for Human Resource Management in the certification department, specifically on test administration security. I've been in the field of certification and test administration for about 15 years, working with some of the people who are on this call or in some of the organizations that folks work for now. This is my first pandemic. So as with most of the people on this call, a lot of this was new to me. So I'm happy to be here and happy to learn from you. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Meyer, and I work for the National Association for Healthcare Quality, and I'm their Senior Certification Program Specialist. And I've been with NACU for a little over 4 years, but I have less than 5 years under my belt of being in the certification world. So similar to Aaron, pandemic threw me off, but especially having newer experience in the field, definitely learned a lot through this process as we navigated to live remote proctoring during the pandemic. As well as offering our testing centers as well. And so I primarily work with our test development team, our candidates, and working through our accreditation as well. So I'm really looking forward to not only sharing what our organization went through, but hearing from everyone else kind of what they experienced and what maybe our group can take and improve upon as well.
Hi, my name is Francis Nerick. I'm the National Director for the American College of Sports Medicine. I oversee our certification programs. We were kind of going the opposite direction of Bill, and where we had 10 certification programs, and now we narrowed it down to 4. And so that's kind of the programs that we have. I also sit on the boards for the Committee on Accreditation for Exercise Science, the Coalition for the Registration of Exercise Professionals, and the last one is a mouthful, the International Confederation of Sport and Exercise Science Practice.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I see many colleagues I recognize. I'm John Weiner. I'm the Chief Scientist at PSI. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and the lens I'll be speaking through today in today's discussion. It's hard to believe I've been in the assessment industry for over 3 decades now. I'm doing what I set out to do, which is focusing on the intersection of science, technology, and measurement. And this topic we're talking about today falls really squarely in that. Even after all this time, I'm super passionate about this industry, as technology has been transforming and will continue to transform testing. There's still a lot of work to do, a lot of problems to solve, and that's what keeps me highly motivated to be involved and engaged in this with you. So I'm really delighted to be joining the panel today with this great panel. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Bob Blackwood, as Alyssa mentioned, I'm a business development manager at Pearson VUE. I've been with Pearson VUE, I think it's going to be 10 years in June, so that's coming up. But I've been in the graded assessment industry for over 15 years, and I work with a lot of clients and sponsors that may be on this phone call. Wow, I did it myself, on this video call, and work with them to support their programs and the candidates that they support. This too is my first pandemic, but let's hope it's our last. Maybe that won't be, but we can hope. So looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Leanne Kwan, and I am Senior Vice President, Test Development Solutions at Prometric. I've been in the industry for about 25 years. Most of it has been in K-12 education and the last 6 years in credentialing assessments. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me at this presentation, and I will toss it back to Bob.
All right, thanks, Luann. So understanding the playing field. So we thought we'd take a moment just to make sure that we are all working from the same playbook, if you will, to further the analogy there. So for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to be focusing on multimodal delivery, which in its simplest form, and these aren't definitive definitions by any means, these are Bob's spin on definitions, but in its simplest form, it is delivering your exam in a multitude of ways that provide options to your candidates for where and when they sit for their assessment, right? Those options can include live remote proctoring or online proctoring, you may have heard it called. That is the process in which, I mean, I think everybody knows what this is, but I'll give you the quick definition. Live remote proctoring is a process in which an exam is delivered over the internet to a device somewhere in the world in an environment controlled by the candidate. It is proctored using a live internet connection through a webcam, and that's how the candidate is proctored. Test center delivery, again, I think we all know what test center delivery is, but quickly, brick and mortar setting that is controlled by the test sponsor or by the vendor or a partner of the vendor, where the candidate is in a defined space, a controlled space, and proctored in person on site. But there are other modes. Other modes could be modes such as record and review, for instance, where the individual, again, is sitting for an exam in a setting of their choosing, but the session is being recorded and reviewed for anomalies at a later date. And there's also a mode out there that kind of lives between test center and live remote proctoring, in which the exam is delivered over the internet to a device somewhere in the world, if you will, but the sponsor is providing a space, right? They're providing the environment, and the proctor is a live proctor on site provided by the sponsor. So it's kind of living in the middle of a test center and live remote proctoring. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to focus on live remote proctoring and test center delivery as they sit in a multimodal environment. So if you want to move on to the next slide there. So program considerations. Today, we're going to go through 4 case studies, first led by the Board of Pharmacy Specialties, then SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, National Association of Healthcare Quality, and then finally the American College of Sports Medicine, where those 4 sponsors are going to be discussing the considerations for moving to a multimodal delivery program. What were the considerations discussed? What were the considerations for and against, if you will, and how they moved forward? So with that, I'll move it over to Bill to kick us off with the BPS case study.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's quite all right.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. So in my introduction, I talked a little bit about who we are at BPS, an autonomous division of the American Pharmacists Association, 14 certification exams. We have previously and are still currently using Windows-based administration 2 times a year, an April-May window of about 4 to 5 weeks, and also a similar size window, September to October. And we're testing about 10,000 examinees per year. What I chose to do, being we have a lot of ground to cover here, is to provide this group with the SWOT analysis that we did back in the height of the pandemic to try to figure out how to make this decision. Ultimately, we landed with using some elements of live remote proctoring, but I would hope that this framework makes sense for other decisions that your organizations may need to make. So I think in the next slide, we're going to talk about the strengths. So again, here were the issues, and you heard Graham mention this earlier, and Bob had mentioned it. Flexibility and convenience is really a strength of a multimodal type of exam, whether that's LRP or other things. And again, this is in the backdrop of 2020. So we were in the height of the pandemic with a lot of uncertainty. Accessibility was important for us because obviously with a lockdown and a pandemic, candidates didn't need to leave their home. So, and even though our candidates work in healthcare and they were leaving their home, some follow-up survey work that we did showed that there was still concerns about venturing out beyond the home or beyond work. So accessibility was important. We looked at different solutions and we wanted to make sure there was a strong technology component and other ways to complement the visual monitoring that would go on with a live remote proctoring solution. Again, we settled on live remote proctoring because we are an accredited program. At the time, the National Commission for Certifying Agencies had a pilot program in place and it was focused on live remote proctoring. Since then has changed policy and now allows live remote proctoring. So that's why we kind of landed on that option. At the time, and this is an interesting one, we thought a strength would be perceived reduction in test anxiety. We actually found in some data that we published later after we did this that I don't know about the anxiety being reduced, but we saw that candidates actually did better in test centers than they did in the LRP environment for our group, and actually took longer to test in an LRP environment than they did in a test center. And I don't know whether that really relates to reduction in test anxiety. We have to do a little bit more work to unpack this data, but I just thought that was interesting. But at the time, again, in 2020, that was one of the things that we looked at. And there's other references that I've seen that shows that people testing them tends to reduce test anxiety. So that was something that we factored into the overall process. A couple other key strengths for us is that we could maintain our Windows-based administration. And from a business perspective, which was important, that we could probably test the majority of our 2020 candidates. And we did. We really didn't see much dip. So they were the strengths. Some of the weaknesses in the next slide that we'll just touch on real quickly here is that there's always an administrative issue if we had to move people from a center to a live remote proctoring venue. We had to make a decision, as the whole world did, very quickly on these things. So the typical way of doing testing and issuing an RFP, we decided not to go through and chose to work with our existing exam delivery vendor, Prometric, to deliver exams via live remote proctoring. The other issue for us in healthcare, because many of our candidates work in health systems, we really didn't know what kind of firewalls that often exist. And, I think that could apply in this days of data security with anyone. So that's an important part of, some kind of remote proctored exam that uses technology is the certifying agency has to consider what firewalls their candidates may come up against. And then you always have to assess the different rigor that's associated with, various proctoring options and see where that fits for your certification. Higher stakes obviously need more rigor. Lower stakes, maybe you don't need as much rigor, but I would say that any breach, high stakes or low stakes, is generally not a good thing for certifying agencies. So the next slide, we want to just touch briefly on some of the opportunities. We saw that in the throes of the pandemic, because, the big lockdown in the US, where a majority of our candidates test, we do test 10% internationally, were, here in the US, and we saw that being proactive to say that you have another option would be seen as good customer service. The other thing that we thought that this could do as an opportunity, particularly in the future, is allow for better global scaling in locations where maybe test centers weren't readily available. So that was an opportunity for us to stick our toe in the water with this kind of thing. We also thought that we could do some research, because one of the things we figured out as we did the SWOT analysis is that there's just not a ton of research out there. I shared with you some of the research that we did publish that actually showed candidates in test centers doing a little bit better than LRP. And again, we need to unpack that a little bit more. But we knew that we could collect data and do some research. So what were some threats? Couple threats, and then we'll wrap up here. I think security, right? That's always an issue, regardless of how you're testing. I think if you're in our industry, security is always a concern. We did talk about this concept of putting the genie back in the bottle. So this is interesting too. We believed in 2020 that once we did this, there would be no turning back. And we don't have any plans to turn back. But I will tell the group that an interesting phenomena happened with our last exam window that ended just a couple of weeks ago. We actually had less people testing via live remote proctoring than we did a year before. We had about 6% of our population using LRP, where before we were averaging about 10, 12%. So I don't know what that means. It could just be a blip for one window. Hard to say, but I thought that was interesting. But back in 2020, we had very open discussions saying, if we do this, there's no turning back. I think someone had put in the chat that, one of the threats for any kind of technology is the reliability of the platform. And it was like the Wild West in 2020. We all know, we all lived through it. So, again, really interesting. And we knew, I kind of grouped these 3 bullet points together. If there were technical issues that, that reflects back on us and our brand. So we wanted to make sure. So how did we, again, you can't figure out every technical issue, but we try to over communicate. And we are now offering a program for people to test drive the exams beyond the system readiness check if they want to do that. So, the other thing that I would mention, it was just it's an anecdotal observation, is that potentially when people do these readiness checks, I would advise them to do it about the time they're going to take the exam, because if someone decides to do a readiness check at 2 a.m. because that's convenient for them, that's great. But if they're going to test at 9 or 10 a.m. when the rest of the world is getting online, that could be an issue. So we talked about the technology. That was an issue with international for us, is that, internet accessibility, bandwidth, technical specifications vary depending on the country. There's also issues with cultural concepts of cheating and what that really means, and relates back to security risk. So these are just things that we saw as threats. Fortunately, our experience has been positive. We did work with our general counsel on legal risks. And so the last slide that I want to end with is just a overview of where we're at. So for our organization, we're still using LRP. I think it's a great option to have another tool in our toolkit, because not only, well, let's hope we never face another global pandemic, but there are normal interruptions that happen. In the throes of the global pandemic, we had social unrest in some cities that closed test centers. I mean, those things happen. So there's, you always have weather related issues. So I think having another option for delivery is a good tool to have in the toolbox. I think I just spoke about the other 2 points, but the big two big ahas, one on the slide and one that I'll end with, is that this pandemic and this process caused us to reevaluate a lot of things. And one of the things we're going to be doing is moving away from a Windows-based administration to continuous testing starting next year in a tiered way, because we were very fortunate that our Windows fell at points when we were seeing some return to normalcy and spikes. And of course, there was returns and then lockdowns, and we know it's bounced all over the place. But we believe that we were at risk through a Windows-based administration and are going to move to more continuous testing. The final comment I'll make in general, because this is kind of my soapbox issue, is that if you're a program, and this is sort of one of my soapbox issues from the time that I served on the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, the program has to own responsibility for all aspects of this. It's just not appropriate to say, well, we've contracted this out. There has to be oversight. So one of our staff always is fond of saying, no one is going to take care of your business like yourself. And that is just so true. And I think applies here. So again, this is kind of a whirlwind overview of our SWOT analysis. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Tim Muckle, who helped us put this together, who at the time was our Senior Director for Psychometrics and Testing, as well as Avis Ballard, who is still our current Senior Director for Quality Assurance. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share this really quick case study with the group today. Appreciate it. Aaron, I guess you're up next.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hello, hello again, everyone. So just a brief introduction on my organization. We are the Society for Human Resource Management. Basically, that's all things work. So it's not necessarily just human resource professionals specifically, but people who work in the field of human resources or are connected to the field of human resources in one way, shape, or form. We deliver two types of exams a year, our certified professional and the senior certified professional exams. They're administered in 2 windows per year. And the first window is May to July. Our second window, it says November to January. It's actually December to February. So I apologize for that. And we administer our exam to approximately 30,000 people a year. So when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of folks expecting that there was going to be an exam for them to take. Next slide, please. So as the pandemic started to become evident, and I say that in February/March, we were having internal discussions about live remote proctoring well in advance of the pandemic itself. But around February of 2020, we could sort of see the writing on the wall, and we knew that we needed to start having that discussion seriously. So when everything locked down in March, we started making our transition from single mode to dual modality. We went through the exam development and the exam, excuse me, the exam assembly process. We beta tested with our staff, and we were actually able to launch just just a little shy of 2 months late. So we still had the same amount of time for all of our examinees to take the exam, but we did have to push the window back a little bit. Next slide. So obviously there were a lot of things that we were considering during the initial parts of the pandemic. And, our first question was really, do we need to make this change? And, obviously everyone is on this call because we sure did. We weren't going to survive as a business if we didn't have some way to deliver the exam during the pandemic. We had no idea how long it was going to last, and we needed to make sure that we were making improvements for our customers. So Bill mentioned system limitations and the questions that we had prior to that. Just to add on to what Bill already mentioned, we really don't know the technological capabilities or know-how of our examinees. And what we really needed to impress upon them was that when you take this exam at home, your home becomes the test center. So there are differences, but there are certain things that are going to have to remain the same. And with that, we're talking about the physical requirements for testing at home. And some people, they'll see, oh, I can test from home. I can test from my couch, or I can test from my bed, wherever. And people were not realizing initially that there were going to be security requirements, and we needed to make sure that everyone knew that we defined what those security requirements would be in advance of the exam, and that we informed all of our candidates of those changes. We also wanted to make sure that there were no advantages or disadvantages to one mode or the other, and also to make sure that we were not exposing the exam risking exposure to the exam during the administration process. So we had to change the structure slightly. The exam was originally 1 4-hour block, and we changed that to 2 2-hour sections with a break in between. And in the test center, examinees have the option for unlimited breaks, but we tried to make it, we tried to mirror those experiences as closely as possible. We try to over communicate. I think we use our vendor Prometric to help us in communication with our examinees. Prometric has a lot of really good information on their website that's available for all candidates, and there is a test driver on that website that allows people to check their capability. But we also wanted to make sure that every stakeholder for the exam had the opportunity to learn the new information, or we needed to make sure that everybody had the same new information. So we also, we had to educate our own employees, people who speak about the exam, and we have educational providers, volunteer leaders. All of those people needed to have all of that information as well. So, and can we go to next slide? So when we're talking about the business and technical requirements, we knew that we were testing a large number of examinees, and that when the live remote proctoring was launching, we were not going to be the only company that was using that product. And we wanted to make sure that the platform that we were using could support all of our examinees, because, yes, live remote proctoring is available 24/7 across the world, but there are staffing requirements. People need to be able to know, in advance how many examinees are going to test. So while it is 24/7, there are some specifics there. And we wanted to make sure, we wanted to be certain that we were able to do that. And one of our major concerns was the ability to offer special accommodations. I apologize, I am losing my voice. One of our major concerns was being able to offer special accommodations in every environment that we had. And we realized that there were certain accommodations that would not be available in would not be available in a home environment. And we needed to have ways to communicate that to our examinees and be certain that they were aware of what we could and couldn't assist them with. So since launching the certification, or excuse me, since launching live remote proctoring, we have the same question that everyone does. Are you still going to use this? Are you still going to offer testing dual modality? And as of right now, we have no changes or planned. And I think I saw in the chat people were throwing out their stats on their live remote proctoring versus being in an in-person environment. And obviously, when the pandemic started, we saw that skew very highly in the direction of online exams. But as things have balanced out, we're still seeing about 55-45. Our examinees, I think, just from a behavioral standpoint, A lot of them are actively working and busy and trying to stay afloat during the pandemic, just like everyone else is. So having the ability to test in the middle of the night is actually helpful for some people. When we're talking about how to improve the user experience, during the entirety of, or excuse me, during the beginning of the pandemic and till now, we take all of our customer feedback into consideration. Sometimes we don't want to, but we do take it into consideration. And especially with the accommodations, we have worked with some of our candidates to improve those, because there are some accommodations that only someone who needs them can really tell us if what we are offering meets their needs, if it's suitable for them. So in part of the live remote proctoring and in excuse me, and in the brick and mortar environment, we've worked with Prometric to test some of their software like JAWS, which is the text to audio software. And also when we bring on new staff who work in the certification department, we try to make sure that they have an opportunity to go through at least a portion of the exam as a candidate and see what that looks like. That way, when someone is speaking to a person outside of our organization, they can actually give a really real notes and real experience on what happened.
All right. Thanks, Aaron, for your portion. And I appreciate you and Bill as well, because I know I'll piggyback off of a lot of what you all have been mentioning that your programs experience. So I work for the National Association for Healthcare Quality, and we have a little over 14,000 certified professionals worldwide. And we offer one certification exam, the CPHQ, and that exam is NCCA accredited and has been for quite some time. I think one kind of unique aspect of our program and our certification is that we serve a wide variety of professionals in this healthcare quality space because our eligibility requirements have a recommendation, but not a requirement. So we recommend that they have at least 2 years of experience in the field, but it's not required. So we do have a wide variety of people and backgrounds coming to take our exam, which I think does make it a little unique. And then our certification is offered worldwide, nationally. So we offer the exam 365, obviously besides major US holidays in the US. And then our international candidates are primarily in 4 2-week testing windows throughout the year. And those international candidates for us are primarily residing actually in the Middle East. So while we offer it nationally, they are a little bit more central to the Middle East. And then with that on the next slide, some of the things that we as an organization had talked about prior to COVID, or some of the things that we were doing with our exam, is that we were delivering our exam at brick and mortar testing centers on computer-based testing through our vendor. So our candidates were very used to going to testing centers, but there were obviously some limitations with that. And those limitations being that they have limited time slots available. Our exam is 3 hours in length, limited dates and options. They could really only find a Thursday at 2 p.m. And so they'd have to take off of work or would have to drive, sometimes a couple of hours to get to that testing center. So prior to COVID, our organization and program was aware of that limitation, and we were looking and trying to find ways to expand upon that. And at the time, we were interested in live remote proctoring. And as some others have mentioned, we're kind of waiting for the NCCA to go through their pilot program to see what came out of it, to see if we could offer live remote proctoring. But we were kind of waiting for that final decision for us to potentially investigate offering live remote proctoring as well. We were also seeing an increased demand for our certification. So our certification was growing rapidly, and we were finding that we weren't having enough testing centers and dates and times available to our candidate prior to COVID. So, or it was just really limiting for them. So we were open to other options to, again, get them more access to taking the exam. And as you know, that other bullet point mentioned, we were really waiting for the NCCA to kind of make that approval for us. And
but if you leave your name and your phone number and a brief message, I'll return your call as soon as I can. Thank you.
Hearing some feedback, if someone could go ahead and mute.
At the tone, please record your message.
Oh, thank you. And, you know, some of the other things that we were considering prior to COVID was international security. So as I mentioned, our exam is offered primarily in the Middle East, and through testing centers, our top priority was making sure that the exam was delivered in a secure way where you know, couldn't participate in any type of brain dumping, or just on the next slide. You know, some of the things that we were reviewing and talking about. Can you guys all hear me okay? I just got a notification that says my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully I don't, you know, get cut off here. But like others had said, you know, COVID happened, and our testing centers began to close. So our vendors started notifying us that those testing centers were closing down, and we were working to find a way to make sure our candidates could continue to test. And so we had notified candidates at the time when the testing centers did begin to close that, you know, we were kind of closing shop for a short period of time. But we extended them through the summer because, quite frankly, we didn't know what was about to happen. But we wanted our candidates to understand that we were going to figure it out, and we were going to support them through this process, especially with a lot of them being at the forefront of this pandemic, being in healthcare and being in hospital and health systems. And so after NCCA had actually released that kind of pilot program approval for live remote proctoring, we right away went and talked to our board and talked to our vendor and said, how can we get live remote proctoring like tomorrow, like in 2 weeks? How can we get this moving? We really want our candidates who are interested in taking the exam to go back through the process. So we, our board approved the launch of live remote proctoring in April of 2020, and we first administered a live remote proctoring exam in May of 2020. So we rapidly turned around and offered and launched live remote proctoring. And some of the things that our board was really focused on when we talked to them and you know, we're reviewing our options with live remote proctoring was on security, as I mentioned prior. So they really wanted to understand how live remote proctoring was going to continue that security of, you know, this high stakes exam like a test center was. So we walked through a lot of the things of, you know, how a remote proctored would, you know, would be on the call, reviewing, watching the candidate take the exam, all of the things that a candidate could be flagged for, the instances in which a candidate's exam would be immediately ended. And so, you know, they were in full support of that. And then with that, some of the things that we started to then implement was that communication to candidates. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, but that was actually, I think, one of our biggest pitfalls. So I saw some chats going on about communication. You can never over communicate. And at the time with COVID, I think we really thought we were doing our best to communicate to candidates about live remote proctoring and what to expect. And so, and we really had an opportunity to provide them with more information. So communication to our candidates was part of it in the middle of COVID, as well as our customer and candidate support. So I know someone, I think Bill mentioned about their customer support and you know, making sure that candidates felt supported through this process. So that was definitely a learning curve for us with our candidates and with our customer service team to now transition to kind of being a tech calling center, you know, candidates calling in with my internet's not stable or I don't know how to get in. And so our customer service team did have to, you know, transition on the fly to be able to support our candidates. We also started to implement some new policies. So as I mentioned, our board was really concerned about security. And so actually different than what I think it was Aaron that you had mentioned about, you guys actually tried to mimic what test centers were doing. We kind of started to create a little bit of differences. And one of those being that those that took the exam on live remote proctoring couldn't have a break. So they did have to sit the duration of the 3 hours. We just find a way to make sure our exam was secure and make sure our board was comfortable if they stepped away for a scheduled break. Now, we had some accommodations come in that we were then able to accommodate for those that really did need that scheduled break through live remote proctoring, but we actually had introduced that they couldn't have a break. So talking about how testing centers, though, did allow them to have that break option. We also used to allow a scratch piece of paper with our exam that then they'd have to tear up or give to the proctor on site. And so we ended up removing that across all modalities where a scratch piece of paper was no longer allowed for the exam for the security purposes. Again, continuing with security, reassuring our board and our candidates that they were being recorded and that there were violations that they, had to be aware of, like talking to someone or having someone come in the room was really important for our candidates to know. And then as long as throughout COVID, testing centers, as they started to reopen, we wanted to make sure that both of those multimodal options were available. We did want our candidates to be able to have both options. It was never kind of a choice for us or our board to only have one option. And so with that on the next slide, I say post-COVID, I still think we're in the midst of it. So not really over yet, but I feel like we've kind of got over that 2020, 2021 rush of everyone trying to figure out what to do, running into that burning fire. But what we are finding, and some of the key takeaways that we are finding, is that for us, that multimodal is imperative for our success. So we really have to offer our testing center and live remote proctoring in order for our candidates to be set up for success. I know in some of our breakout rooms too, we were talking about how, candidates are now being asked to be the testing center. And so we want to be really upfront with candidates that that's what they're walking into, but we have to give them another option in order to be successful if they don't have an at-home environment to do that. As I mentioned too, that clear and consistent candidate communication is really, really required for us. So when we first launched live remote proctoring, our completion rate, so candidates, being able to take the exam and complete it within their scheduled time, was really low. It was about 70% of our candidates actually were getting through that completion process. It was then when we talked to our vendor about what things can we do to make our candidates more successful. They were talking about how we didn't even have a web page dedicated to our candidates. And so it's almost immediately when we put up this web page and we put a little bit more resources out in front for our candidates, our completion rate has now jumped to 95%. So almost in about a month, we saw that change of our candidates being able to access those resources through us, through NAECU, to be set up for success. So we really, really believe that you can never over communicate, and making sure candidates have all of the tools to be successful. We also found that live remote proctoring provides that accessibility for those exam dates and times. So in the beginning, we were really struggling to find dates and times available for our candidates. And now this has expanded the offerings to candidates. But we are upfront with candidates as well that testing centers for us is still the most dependable option. It's really, if they have any fear of their internet going out or that testing anxiety, we really encourage them to go to a testing center, because while our live remote proctoring is still an awesome platform, it does put a lot of that anxiety on candidates. And we're really trying to make our candidates understand and have some ownership a part of this process. And then, of course, we're still reviewing exam policies for our live remote proctoring and any opportunities to improve upon it. And I would also say that our vendor support is critical. So our testing vendor is PSI, and some of the things that we did also consider through our security measures and getting our board on board with doing live remote proctoring is that we do a forensic analysis after all of our international testing windows and in the US as well. So we're constantly monitoring on how our exam stats are performing and if live remote proctoring was impacting them at all, concern of security, and they were not. For us, we are not finding any differences in the candidates having an advantage being in live remote proctoring. Similar to Bill, we're actually finding that they're not performing as well doing live remote proctoring. And we're still having about 60% of our candidates choosing live remote proctoring over testing centers. So that was a little bit about our program. And with that, I'll hand it over to Francis.
All right, you'd think I would have this mute unmute thing figured out by now, but it's still a challenge every day. My name is Francis Nerk. I'm the National Director of Certification for the American College of Sports Medicine. We have about 34,000 active certified professionals in our organization. We have 4 certification programs. 3 of them are accredited. 1 of them is in progress. The 2 group exercise and personal trainer do not require a degree, but the last 2 exercise physiologists and clinical exercise physiologists require a degree and or some experience. Go to the next slide. So I'm not going to repeat kind of like what Bill, Aaron, and Alyssa have done. So I'm just going to talk about more of the kind of the business, I guess, the decisions we made with our board. So pre-COVID, ACSM administered paper and pencil exams on campus. And so that was one of the big considerations. When we did convert to computer-based exams, the faculty, the feedback that we got from stakeholders, especially faculties at universities, that they felt like there was a disconnect between our certification agency and the part of being essential as part of the graduation component. So getting people prepared for the workforce. Now that the paper pencil exams were no longer delivered on campus, there was a kind of a longing for that. There was sort of nostalgia for having the exams delivered on campus, and I think that was a challenge. I think even pre-COVID. The certifications were, I think I kind of skipped over the second bullet, but the certifications were part of the curriculum. So when candidates were kind of preparing for the workforce, they would take our exams, and they wanted to really kind of see how we can get that reestablished back on campus. And so even pre-COVID, we were looking at opportunities to work with our vendor to deliver them on campus beyond just the computer testing sites on campus. Go ahead to the next slide. So I think when COVID hit and we were looking at opportunities to expand our channels because test trainings were closed and live remote proctoring was available, and the NCCA gave us the thumbs up to be able to do that. I think one of the big things that we looked at is the availability for our vendor to get us onto live remote proctoring as quickly as possible. And so we are a small to medium-sized organization with our vendor, which is Pearson VUE. So being able to kind of look at, how you're turning these testing centers on, do you have to wait in line? And if you had to wait in line for 6 months or so, other opportunities for us to look at other multiple vendors for us to do test delivery. That is certainly a consideration for us. But looking at that is the throughput of getting the exams on to an LRP. Were there going to be costs involved with bringing your bank over? Were there going to be, how long is it going to take us to get there? And so when we balance that out, we really kind of stuck with our current vendor because it just made it was a much more efficient process for us to do that, and especially in a very short window. One of the things that we considered as well is balancing accessibility and then exam security. I think everyone's kind of talked about that already. For us, is just like it was challenging for candidates to be able to drive hours away, and then in the midst of COVID, whether or not you can depend on whether a test center was open was not going to work for us. It was for our organization. We look at certifications. We have certifications and memberships. The vast majority of our revenue comes from certification. So that was a non-negotiable. We needed to get those online as quickly as possible. I think this is kind of what Alyssa was describing. I think customer support was really critical for us, especially when you had candidates who wanted to switch channels, and how did that affect your testing, and also we had cancellation fees and policies in place, and so we had to really kind of revamp our policy manual and look at when you're taking these exams, do we allow that? That was consideration. We did allow for switching, but if you wanted to switch modes, from in-person to online, our fees involved now. So it was really walking through that through our kind of the operational process with our company was really important. In terms of the cancellations, we've actually seen fewer cancellations with LRP. It's the one of the things we did let them cancel as many times as we want. We added fees, but with LRP, we saw fewer and fewer actual cancellations because when they could take it whenever they wanted. I think that was one of the big things we saw. Equitable test delivery, we kind of talked about that with accommodations and unscheduled breaks. Now we're looking at switching from switching all of our exams to a battery of exams instead. So to force a scheduled break. I think that's one of the things that we're looking at doing as well. So that changes our policies. And so that just the whole ripple effect of working with our vendor and then also our related policies. In terms of reassessment of delivery channels, I think after this year, we're going to look at whether or not we continue to go with mixed modal. I think one of the things is we did notice that LRP, it was a substantial lower pass rates in LRP in comparison to in-person delivery. We're unsure about that, what happened. We don't know if it's less ability candidates that were taking the exams or it was just the mode. So we're working with our psychometrician to figure that out. The other one is kind of going back to kind of mixed modes. We're looking at a potential opportunity for a third option beyond just LRP. Is there a way to deliver an LRP in a hybrid model, delivering those on campus? And what are those opportunities, whether we can do that there, or are there opportunities for us to look at monitoring ourselves, using our own proctors? So those are things and considerations of channels. And for us, in terms of the balance between accessibility and exam security, I think we are a little bit more balanced on increasing accessibility to our exams. I think there's the consideration when we're looking at that is the balance of it is the number of credential owners or certification owners in the space. In ours, we have about 20 or so organizations that offer personal training certifications. And so you really kind of spread the exam security risk among all the organizations, and then also you have to balance it with accessibility as well. So that's one of the things we looked at. I think the next slide, I think, might be done. One more slide. I'm going to hand it over to John.
Thank you, Francis. Yeah, so far we've heard some great case studies, and we've heard about some of the journeys, the considerations from a business operational standpoint, and many important factors. So I'm going to pivot the conversation just a bit and talk a little bit about, from a measurement standpoint, some key considerations. And actually these aren't new, of course. They're just illuminated more by multimodal testing with greater concerns on measurement quality. Of course, we're still concerned about are the scores that result for candidates testing through multiple modes psychometrically sound? Are they comparable across modes? Do different testing conditions impact scores? And what about technology? So all of that is a consideration. The candidate experience is highlighted more because candidates are testing in their own environments. So and how they perceive that experience and whether those perceptions impact their performance on the test is even more important to focus on. Yeah, so that's another key consideration. And of course, the big elephant in the room is always security. Security has always been a concern, and it's some would argue it's a greater concern with multimodal testing. And so, in addition to live remote proctoring, from a pure statistical view, there are other ways to look for issues with testing, security issues, and one of those is around what is called data forensics or security analytics. And using those types of analytics to supplement what a proctor can see. Proctors can't see everything, so it gives another viewpoint in terms of response patterns. So putting those together, looking for cheating, compromise of content, copyright infringement of protected intellectual property, things like that, and looking for modality differences, just monitoring programs. So I always tend to oversimplify just for ease of communication. And so those are the three areas I would highlight as key measurement considerations. And I want to talk about those. And at the end of the day, really, what we're concerned about is, the measurement people are concerned about the scores that get produced. We want to have confidence in the scores that are produced for candidates. They need to be, of course, valid and accurate, reliable and precise, fair and unbiased, and not impacted by irrelevant factors. We just want to measure what we're intending to measure. So we're the guardians, the standard bearers of that, and we're focusing on that in our everyday lives, supporting our clients and programs. So let's click on and look at this from a research standpoint. Now, Bill made a very good point earlier that, as part of this shift to multimodal testing with live remote proctoring, there are a lot of opportunities or new opportunities to do research, and I think they're essential to do. What I want to highlight here is some of this research. There hasn't, because one thing about this multimodal testing is there has not been a lot of published research to date on how the efficacy of it, especially live remote proctoring, with some of the issues that I mentioned just a moment ago. And so I was tapped on the shoulder and didn't say no to being the guest editor for the Journal of Applied Testing Technology to do a recent issue devoted to live remote proctored testing in a high stakes environment. And so if you haven't seen it, I'll just give a shameless plug. Check it out. The link is up here. And I'll talk a little bit about some of this research today, because I think it's really helpful. We're all interested in evidence-based practice and moving towards that. And I think this helps move the needle a little bit. So in this collection, there's a nice summary of the articles and synthesis of the articles, and I'll talk more about some of the conclusions on a later slide. But really, it begins with a nice literature review that gives us a picture of the evolution of online testing. It was around, obviously, before COVID, and it's a fascinating journey to look at what was going on in employment testing, educational testing, and other arenas for high, medium, and low stakes testing. But that was important because it laid out the infrastructure for online testing, and to see it laid out, Tom Langenfeld does a great job. After that, I would say at the core of this collection are 3 different papers that are presenting empirical studies, looking at one in a medical college admissions environment, another paper by Greg Hertz, my colleague, on cross-mode study on 6 high-stakes licensing and certification exam programs, and then a third paper that was based on some pharmacy specialty exams that actually, I think some of this was again alluded to by Bill earlier, is in this collection. And I'll talk about the results in a moment, but these are all by and large focusing on cross-mode efficacy in terms of comparability, psychometric quality, and so forth. And then some of the papers touch on other issues, such as technology effects, candidate experience, and data forensic differences or potential differences across modalities. And then last but certainly not least is a very intriguing paper by Kirk Becker and his colleague on a computational method, sort of a quick computational method for looking at test score similarity, focusing, especially for collusion. And I think it's sort of a provocative method, and I look forward to seeing more research on that one. But let me give some highlights next, if you will. Let's click on and to look at some of the results. And what did these studies see? And it's not black and white, first of all. But I've organized this really into 4 compartments to really talk about, well, what is this research telling us so far? Well, 2 of the studies found no differences at all between test score means, the distributions of scores, the reliability of scores between modes. So test center candidates taking tests in test centers versus live remote proctored exams. They're showing good statistics, good psychometrics, and comparable in the sense of no statistically significant differences. The pilot study at the BPS did report a result with actually sort of, to many, maybe counterintuitive in terms of test score candidates scoring higher than LRP candidates, test center candidates versus LRP candidates. And I think the upshot of that was there were some anecdotal evidence that, well, maybe these populations are different, which is intriguing, but not enough data to really, tease it out in a quantitative way. But it did make a very important point, is that, when we don't find differences, the conversation's pretty easy. When we do find differences, we have explaining to do, and we have to explain it. And the implication is there's a need to gather, make sure operationally we're collecting more information about the testing conditions and the characteristics of the candidates so that we can do some explaining, take these things into account. From a technology standpoint, very quickly, a really interesting finding by the medical college. They looked at internet disruptions. They tracked that. They looked at dead lag time and looked for mode differences. And rolling all this into a multiple regression, they found that what really accounted for the differences mostly was where the source of their medical degree was. So a characteristic of the test takers that was very different between modes accounted for the differences. Candidate experience, very quickly, in the studies that reported that, they were generally favorable across the board, and not associated with test modality, which is the effect you want to see. So no correlation between someone's experience ratings and how well they did on an assessment, which is the finding we want to see. And lastly, there was one study that looked at forensics between modes and found no differences in aberrant response patterns. So the patterns weren't high and they weren't different, which was encouraging. So, to wrap this up, to summarize on my last slide, if you will, thank you. My takeaways are this, is that the results are encouraging. We can't say they're definitive, but they're encouraging to those who had to move forward with live remote proctoring. So it's certainly, the efficacy of scores is, is sound. So whether or not differences were observed, the scores were reliable, and the psychometrics were looking good. So the caveats there are, we're not always going to have a comparable result. So we should be prepared to, we should be monitoring and be prepared to explain it and what to do about it. Candidate experience and disruption are important to monitor. We should be monitoring that. Now, in the couple of studies we had, we didn't see any impact on scores, but it doesn't mean, we shouldn't continue to monitor it. We should. Data forensics are important and should be part of every program, I believe, especially where feasible. Where it's feasible to do it, we should be monitoring, have a security analytics piece in place as part of the psychometric routine. And at the end of the day, continuous monitoring is needed. And so, it takes a team, it takes a village. It's not just the psychometricians. It's really the program operations, security ops, psychometricians, legal, all working together. So, with that, that's my quick take. I think I've used all my time, but those are some takeaways, but I'd encourage you to look at that research. I know Leanne next is going to present some of her published research that's pretty new. And I know there's one article that just came out. I saw the advanced preview in the Journal of Educational Measurement that's a cross-mode study. So it's encouraging. We're going to start seeing more research on this, and it's great to see science supporting practice. With that, I'll pass it to Leanne.
Thanks, John. And for those of you who require further empirical evidence before being convinced of mode comparability, I have two studies that I actually would like to talk about. So these studies really started off as studies to answer some of our clients' questions. So the basic premise is that high stakes credentialing exams were really designed to be administered under standardized conditions. And at test centers, candidates are assigned to workstations outfitted with computers that are configured the same way and have the similar dimensions, and they sit in, you know, in spots that are, you know, set up in a similar manner. However, in live remote proctoring, candidates are allowed to take the exam using their own devices in a location of their choosing. So the primary question that we really wanted to answer for our clients was really, does the non-standard testing experience in live remote proctored exams affect candidates' performance? And the two studies we did, if we can move forward, Eliza. We did two studies. The first study was based on 11 exam titles delivered in 4 states. And it was centered on one program, the insurance program. And we had candidate volumes totaling 14,000, slightly over 14,000. And in our study, you'll see that 2/3 of the candidates chose to take their tests in the test center. And we have about 1/3 that actually opted for live remote proctoring. And in study 2, we broadened the exam because we looked at the results in study 1 and said, you know, how much of this is really because of the fact that we're getting information from one exam program, maybe the population's a little bit more homogeneous in that setting. And so we attempted to do a second study based on 11 titles, also delivered across the US. We had 8 different programs centered around healthcare, security, and energy. And for this particular study, we had over 12,000 candidates. And again, the breakdown was, again, 2/3 in the test center, and then 1/3 of the candidates opting to take the tests through live remote proctoring. Next slide. So the results from summary 1, the results from study 1, as I mentioned, showed similar average scores across the 2 modes, comparable pass rates for both proctoring modes. The test reliability for exams delivered through different proctoring modes were equal. We also had comparable average decision consistency. But what we found was an even identical item difficulty, average item difficulty. But what we found was that the discrimination index was lower for candidates who actually attempted the exam at test centers. And the other finding that we saw is that candidates in test centers took almost 5 minutes longer on average to complete their examination. And we found very similar results in study 2 on the next slide. And again, across the 13 exams, we found that pass rates did not differ significantly. Out of the 14 exams, but we had one exam that had significantly higher pass rates for live remote proctored exams. The test center modes demonstrated high reliability, high decision consistency, and high classification accuracy across both modalities for all exams. Contrary to study 1, we found identical average item difficulty. So we had comparable average item discrimination. So So I apologize. Like study one, we found identical item difficulty, but then unlike study one, we found comparable average discrimination for the items across proctoring modes. And in study two, we also found that for 12 of the 14 exams, there was candidates who tested at test centers took significantly longer time to complete their tests. So this averaged about 10 minutes longer as opposed to the first study, which was approximately 5 minutes longer. And for study two, because of the, we took it a step further and really did conducted an additional analyses. We did a diff analysis, which is differential item functioning, just to look at whether individual items perform differently across the different modes when you actually compare for performance, candidate performance. And what we found was none of the operational items flagged for moderate to severe diff. And the other finding that we saw was that 7 out of over 2,000 operational items flagged for slight to moderate diff. And there was no particular direction for these flags. So 5 of the 7 items favored test center proctoring, and 2 out of the 7 items that flagged favored live remote proctoring. So as you can see, our results across both study 1 and study 2 were very similar. And with the exception of the item discrimination being slightly lower for test center administrations in study 1. And we continue to plan on further investigations to examine the test time differences. Right now, we think, there could be so many reasons for it, but, the question that keeps popping up for us is really how much does the slightly lower test times in live remote proctoring, is that a result of candidates being more comfortable with their computer setup? The fact that they're actually attempting the exam using a mouse and keyboard that they recognize. And so that continues to be a question that we're interested in digging into. So I thank you, and I hand it back to Elisa.
Thanks. Thank you, Leanne, and everybody. We had wonderful conversations going on in the Q&A. And I'm going to start at the end because this is particular to your presentation, Leanne. And the question was there any control on the 2 groups? Like, did they have any similarities, perhaps in the same ability level?
The control, this wasn't a controlled empirical study. It was really something that we use test administration data to actually look at group differences. We could not, actually assign candidates to one or the other test environment. So there really was no real control group in this situation. But as I mentioned, the diff analysis that we did on the second study, we were able to hold constant the performance or the ability levels of the candidates. And then within that ability level, look at how candidates performed on each of the items on the tests delivered through live remote proctoring, as well as in test centers.
Great, thank you.
Dr.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I asked a question regarding the ability control at the beginning, right? Because when we do a mode comparability study, we want to make sure the 2 groups we look at have the same ability level. Otherwise, the observed difference could be due to the mode difference, or could be due to the ability difference, or could be both. So there is a confounding issue here.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to mention a recent the JEM article that is upcoming, actually looking to the the controllability issue, like I'll let Paul or Dr. Jones to talk about more details here, but the study actually, compare the group difference and did find like the mode difference. And also there's some indicator of, test security might be compromised. So we'll turn to Dr. Jones to talk about details of the study.
Paul, you want to take it? Paul,
I
are you
just saw
there?
the post.
Yeah. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Well, we did two different things. We matched. We had 3 matched groups, 2 testing center groups and 1 OP group, and we matched them on their pool scale scores. So we made them as close as we could, and these were groups of more than 4,500, right? And then we they all saw the same items, and we recalibrated the items within each group. And then we used one of the groups as a validation sample, and we rescored that validation sample using the different calibrations. So we rescored a testing center sample with another testing center calibration and an online proctored calibration. And we found no difference when we used the testing center calibration on the testing center group, but we did find differences when we used the OP calibration on the testing center group. Differences in instance of differential item functioning and pass rate differences. Now, pass rate differences were small, but we've done this a couple of times now, and the difference in pass rate using the same people, just with different calibrations from different modes, can be, we've seen from 1 to 3%, and we've got the same people that we're rescoring. So that's, that could be concerning. It's small, but is it ignorable? And so it seems like we need to look at this issue of concurrence with matched samples. It seems important.
Thank you. Along the same lines of the analysis and how it's approached, Eric D'Astolfo had asked whether, in addition to the focus on pass rates and p-values across modalities, is anybody looking at the response similarity indices? And Eric, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because I'm not quite sure a lot of us would know what that is.
Yeah, just quickly, since I know it's time, and again, thank you for these efforts.
And actually, we have time. We really can go through 12, so we're not in any rush.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to clarify, looking at pass rates and p-values is of course really important. We've just noticed more differences among programs once you factor in response overlap. And Kirk, of course, can speak more to this. And once we kind of pull that back and we looked at it across 1 million deliveries, some programs were seeing much higher levels of collusion, others, and I think some of the programs here today seem to thankfully be in that category where their risk level, there's not as many incentivized item harvesters and cheaters necessarily, because they all vary by program. So the question is, could we see more of that, maybe introduce the idea of the risk profile of a program can impact its comparability on OP, because you invite things that you would, that you may not invite in a test center environment the same way. But again, to response similarity, I should defer to Kirk or Hui Zhang, who I believe are in the audience.
Why don't you let me answer that one? I answered it in the chat. There actually is one published paper in that collection of JAT papers that looks at response similarity, test time differences, a whole suite of indices. And that paper actually references another paper that describes what the suite of indices are. But I think it's the only, I did just receive the advance email for the GEM paper that all of you have been talking about. Thank you for, the background on it here today. But in terms of the issue of response similarity that you're asking about, there are different indices. We have a proprietary one we've developed, and we use others too, of course. But I think we present some data on that in the paper, looking at 7 high stakes licensing and certification programs, and report on that. And in generally, in those programs, not seeing a difference, not seeing an appreciable difference in flag rates. It depends. There's so many nuances and deep details, I think, that are way beyond the scope of this conversation, but for people to think about. But in terms of like a utility-based view of similarity analysis or cheating analysis or IP theft analysis or any of the risks, I think the lens that was used in the analysis that was reported was gave some good insights to that. So I think there is a paper looking at it, and we need a lot more papers looking at that. I agree,
John. And I think also the scale helps, right? Because the case studies I find very useful, like the ones today. But I think the more breadth we get across different kinds of programs, I also think that'll get better. But again, I applaud the efforts to start this research, which wasn't really anywhere before 2020. And now it's pretty impressive what's coming out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks to the Pearson VUE people for all of your good comments.
There were 2 more observations, and I know that some of it has been responded to, but can you talk, and I guess, Aaron, maybe this is more for you, about some of the accommodations that you've seen requested? I think the first gut reaction is, well, they're at home. Don't they have all the accommodations that they need? But in other cases, based upon the chat, and I don't know how many people have looked at the chat, but can you talk about some of the accommodations that you've seen, the requests that you've seen for those that are doing proctored exams at home? And if not you, Aaron, then whoever is best to answer that. But Aaron, why don't you try first, I think.
Excuse me. So we see the standard accommodation requests, so time extensions and things of that nature. What we were discussing in the chat, I think, were some things that we've had difficulty with, and there was mention of anything that requires assistance, like on-site assistance from another individual. So a reader or a scribe, we've run into issues there because you have to administer those exams at a test center. The other thing we've encountered are examinees who are unaware that they need to request a specific accommodation, especially when they're in their home environment. We've had, I'm at home. Why can't I go to the bathroom whenever I want? I'm at home. Why can't I have all of my food and what have you with me if I want to take a sip? My favorite is, why can't I smoke? Because sometimes you have to tell people, even though you are at home, don't get that comfortable.
That's great. You just tell them not to smoke in general, but
hey, that's between you and the Surgeon General. But when you do it, we have to have a conversation.
Yeah. And the other comment, this is an earlier one, and this one actually hits close to home in our organization, and that's the internet stability. And we've actually put in our approval to test email that we highly recommend that you connect to a router. And this is where age comes in, because a lot of people go, I don't know what that is. What do you mean I have to hardwire? They don't know the expression hardwire. And it's really weird, but and those that have switched from live remote proctoring who had a failed attempt, because even though they tested this system, it didn't work on the day of testing, they said, oh, I'm not going to do this again. I'm just going to go to a test center, because they were totally boggled by the requirements and didn't know what meant to hardwire into your internet. So that's the way we handle this, by putting into the acceptance letter, but we're still having issues. Is anybody else, how are other people handling the internet stability issue? And do you grant them a free test? What happens on your side of the fence?
So we have a couple of issues that we work with. We actually tell people there's a certain number of times that your exam can dip under the bandwidth level. So if you get those drops, we will actually say, okay, bump the brakes, your exam has to stop, and we're going to require you to go to a test center because these interruptions are going to continue. And we also make the same suggestion of hardwiring into your router. We have basic tech support on our side and on the vendor side to offer assistance if someone doesn't know how to do that. But we have seen folks come back to us fairly often and say, you know what, this was not the right thing for me to do. You know, I'd like another opportunity. And depending upon the circumstances, we'll work with those candidates.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and share a question, and of course that may be that two people start at the same time, but we'll get to everybody. There's wonderful comments going on in the chat. I hope that you all get a chance to see the chat. Is there anything that somebody would like to share based upon their experience, their lessons learned, and or one of the vendors who wants to give guidance on any issue that they wish they said during their presentation, but forgot to or didn't think they had the time to? Or any of the clients themselves. All right, so at this point in time, I really want to thank our presenters for an exceptional job, and the comments are coming through. And Bill, you're right, it's important to encourage the system readiness check, but as you said in your presentation, sometimes that's not even enough. And when they're running the test or trying to they've done their test, but they didn't realize that they had a background program running in the background. So I don't know if the chat can be shared via email. I will try to, I don't know, I'll try to figure that out, but no promises. So thank you to our presenters, really engaging and interesting. And just when you thought you wouldn't understand the psychometric aspect of it, you guys broke it down really well. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, John. And thank you those that participated on that topic. At this point, are there any announcements from the general audience about maybe job postings? Anything that you want to share, that would be great. This is the time, but if we were live, we would have people stand up and say, yes, I've got something to say. So I'm going to keep quiet and ask that anyone who has anything to share, please speak your announcements.
Pearson VUE is hiring a business development manager, and you don't have to be based out of warm and sunny Minneapolis. So in case you were, unless you want to move here, that's totally fine. But check out our website.
I have one. It's not a job opening. It's actually someone that you might want to recruit. There's a young man I met, and he does coaching for the ACT college test. He's got a degree, but he is just an excellent editor. I had him put him through some of my test question editing, and he just was spot on. And I thought he would make a great item editor, item writer. If anybody's looking for someone like that, he would be entry level because he hasn't been in the industry before. But if you're interested, you can reach out to me.
Kathy, could you send that to me? I'll send a message in the chat. I'd love to get connected there.
You know what? I'll send you my email address in the chat, and you can, and then we can get in touch, and I can put you in touch with him because he's interested too. He's very interested. He's in, he's been, anyway, we'll talk. There's my email address.
I think Bill's comment,
Yeah.
Bill's comment, the last comment there is probably I think the most underrated comment of the meeting, that the amount of handholding we have to do for candidates to go to LRP was, I think we way underestimated that, the amount of time we had to handhold candidates.
Great. Jennifer Norton is saying that she's hiring a certification specialist. I direct you to look at the chat to get Jennifer's email address. I also want to again thank our sponsors. I listed them early on, and I didn't want to fumble through that again because I know I'll get tongue twisted, but without doubt, this couldn't happen without our sponsors. So thank you. if there's anything else, I'm going to keep the meeting running just so that if I'm afraid to stop it and not save the chat, but I'm getting coached over here on how to save the chat. So hopefully we'll get the chat saved and CNG will know how to post it and all that. So I thank you very much. This has been a wonderful session. Our presenters very knowledgeable, our audience just as knowledgeable. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. And thanks for joining us. And thanks for sharing all the articles.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, how do I do this now?